back where we started. Here we go round again. Did want to make one last comment about the whole thing, fascination with sports, and then we're going to just put that subject to bed for good. Which I realized the one last connecting thing that I didn't mention before was that I'm a lover of history. That's what I majored in college. That's where I got my degree in. I love history. I'm far more interested in the past than I ever will be in the future, which is why I'm not a big sci-fi fan. I'm more a fan of documentaries. And so when I was a kid, I would just pre-internet days, obviously. So I would go to the library and get books on Sandy Koufax or Joe Namath or Mickey Mantle or I remember reading the Bobby Orr story. That's how I first found out about Bobby Orr.
Just let me interject
Yep.
just to show that we're on the same page. The very first book I ever read, Larry Zonka and Bob Greasy, the Miami Dolphins 1-2 punch.
Yes, exactly, and that sort of stuff. And so it was that too. So it was the history of sports,
Yeah.
that and then you're always comparing this guy to that guy. Is Connor McDavid better than Gretzky? Is LeBron James better than Jordan? And that's the whole thing about sports, and that's the whole part of history of it. So
I
there's
I
that.
totally gravitate towards that stuff too. It's always endlessly fascinating if it's about a topic that you're just really naturally interested in, whether it be music, film, World War II history, sports, whatever. I too gravitate towards that more than anything that is somewhat more contemporary. I find most things, most cultural things anyway, that our contemporary pale in comparison to what's already gone on for so many different reasons.
Yeah, for one thing is now you can look back and you can judge it through different, view it through different lenses. As a matter of fact, right before I came on to for us for our chat, I was watching an interview with Pete Townsend from I guess the late '90s, and he was talking about the Rock and Roll Circus,
Hmm.
and it's really interesting to hear him talk about it, years later, and talking about a quick one. And about Mick Jagger and how impressed he was with Mick, like holding it together with everything that was going on, and Mick was really, running the whole thing. And it was like 4 in the morning, and he said Mick still has the energy to perform, and he said everyone else is just wasted. And he said he became a huge fan that day. He realized like what it took. And so
Yeah,
it's
I've
interesting.
seen that same interview or
Yeah.
heard that same interview, and if I remember correctly, it's really what cemented for Townsend how great of a performer Mick Jagger was. I don't think he had realized up to that point that Mick was like the real deal, and seeing him perform then and there really
He
cemented it for him.
Yeah, he mentions he said when you're watching the Who, he said we're enjoying what we're doing, but we're enjoying it for ourselves, and you see us more from the side. He said when you're watching Mick is looking straight at you, like he's connecting to you in the audience, you in the camera, you at home, and he said it's just amazing to watch someone do that. And it's interesting because I've seen so many different performers over the years, as have you, and some people really do connect with the audience, and some people are definitely more introverted.
Hmm.
And the more an artist connects with the audience, the more enjoyable it is for the most part. That's again why I like Springsteen, why I like The Clash. I like that engagement. It doesn't mean I
Hmm.
can't enjoy it when it's not like that, but I do have an extra enjoyment from that.
That ropes you in that much more or pulls you in that much more. Um, so speaking of the rock and roll circus, I've always found it really interesting that the Stones wouldn't allow that to be released for like 20, 25, 30 years after it was originally filmed because mainly, I'm sure it was mainly Mick and Keith, or maybe just Mick, was not happy with the Stones' performance.
Right.
And in particular, they were comparing themselves to the Who's performance, which, is of their mini opera, a quick one, which really is like just a phenomenal performance. The Who, they're kind of at the height of their powers then,
No
even
question.
though it was before Tommy and Who's Next and Quadrophenia and all that stuff. Boy, that whatever it is, like 8 minute performance of that is just unbelievable.
Amazing. That's my favorite Who song, just from that performance.
And
But Pete also mentions that he was impressed that Mick had the power to not release it.
yeah, yeah.
He said like the Who, we didn't have that power at that time. He said we got it later on, but we certainly
Uh,
didn't have it then.
uh, and it is. I remember when it was finally released. I mean, it was like this holy grail,
Yep.
if you're a rock and roll fan, to be able to finally see that. And
Hmm.
I remember getting the video and bringing it home. I think I was probably still living at my parents' house at that point. It was probably, I don't
Hmm.
know, in the mid to late 80s, but whenever it was. And uh, we had seen the Who's performance over the years because it was included
Sure.
in The Kids Are All Right.
Yep.
So to finally get to see the whole thing, and in particular the Stones performance, which I think is amazing. Mick,
Yep.
of course, is amazing in it. The rest of them are amazing in their own way. And to hear a version of Sympathy for the Devil, which actually they actually tried to play it like the studio version with the same type of percussion and what have you, as opposed to like say every other live version you've heard of it, which isn't even close, doesn't capture the spirit or the feel of the studio version at all, but that version did. And it was also really just interesting to see like Brian Jones at that point really looks like he looks like he's half dead, just barely looking like he can stand, let alone play anything. And it's really a fascinating document.
Pete says that he didn't know Brian was going to die shortly thereafter, but he knew that was his last performance with the Stones. He said there was no
As
question.
it was.
He-
Yeah,
that
yeah, sad,
yeah,
sad, but also um, really great to be able to finally see that because it
yeah.
really
No,
is
I
a
was
cool
I was so excited.
performance.
I remember. Yeah.
It
Um,
came out right after they had released or at least released or recorded the songs for Beggar's Banquet. And you don't see a lot of live performance of the Stones from that era. At least I haven't. There's not much out there. And to see them doing songs off of Beggar's Banquet was really cool.
yeah, it's interesting. Like there are a couple albums between the buttons. I don't think I've heard a live version of any of those songs.
Oh,
Oh wait,
let's
Ruby
spend the
Tuesday's
night
on there.
together.
Okay, yeah. Okay,
What
there are a couple,
and
but
yeah,
but
there was a couple really big hits that they had played throughout the years.
but
But
I mean,
from that era,
but
probably you
but I
probably
mean,
haven't
like My
seen much.
Obsession, all sold out.
None of
Yesterday's
that.
Papers, Cool, Calm, Collected. You know,
In the biz we call those deep cuts.
yeah. And so it's just interesting. It's also interesting to see the change in audiences over the year. One of the things I've talked about before and complaining about, if you're trying to listen to a live album of the early 60s, it's just all girls screaming their heads off and you can't even enjoy it at all. And as I've said before, it would drive me crazy as a performer. But then, because I also saw Pete in another thing talking about the Isle of Wight Festival, and a lot of the people at the Isle of Wight Festival were mad at the bands for charging for their performance. They wanted them to give the money back.
Hmm.
And it was a whole nother weird audience, like, because it was all about, revolution and power to the people, and they
Yeah.
should be playing for free,
Yeah,
and
you
then,
should. It's all. What's this capitalism nonsense?
yeah.
What do you mean you want to be paid?
And then
All a bunch of horse shit.
years later with punk, they're spitting on the performers as a show of adulation. It's like, it's just weird how audiences have changed over the years in terms of expectations. I wonder when was the first mosh pit, you know?
Um, yeah, it's a good question. Probably sometime around 75 or 76 in London, I would guess.
Because then that became a part of shows.
Hmm.
Although also another thing which would have driven me crazy in the 67, 68 was the background psychedelic, on the screens. That
Yeah,
would that
the basically projected cells.
Yeah.
Yeah, that which I think became popularized by shows at the Fillmore East
Yeah.
originally, is where that stemmed from. And then the Fillmore West started doing it as well. There was, along with Bill Graham starting the Fillmore East and Fillmore West venues, there was these light companies that got their start in
Yep.
cahoots with Bill Graham. So
Yep.
Bill Graham would promote the show and get the bands together, and then there would be these light shows that would come in and do, what you're talking about for different artists.
It was interesting because then there were also the poster guys who designed the posters for those
Uh-huh.
shows. So there's this whole, ecosystem,
I
you
have
know.
one on my wall right behind us, an
There you go.
original one.
Thank you for not projecting psychedelic cells.
Yeah.
That would have given me a migraine trying to watch that.
Well, I
And
imagine if you're on acid, um,
I've been on acid at
at those
shows and I
no,
wouldn't like it.
yeah, okay.
And it's funny because two of the bands that we really like, one your particular favorite, Pink Floyd, one of my particular favorite, Grateful Dead, they were big, progenitors of that, sort of
Hmm.
thing. So, um,
Circling back to
yeah,
the sports thing, I just wanted to comment on one of the things that, in particular, talking about sports history, one of the things that makes that era, to me anyway, so much more interesting and compelling and authentic is like if you watch footage from, I don't know, even going up to the early 80s, but mainly back in the 70s and 60s of old like NHL playoff games. They're like the ESPN channel has stuff like that. You could like watch, the 1967 finals between the Montreal Canadiens and the Toronto Maple Leafs. But anyway, back then, um, the ice wasn't completely covered with corporate logos. The boards were not covered with corporate logos. The uniforms were not covered with corporate logos. The helmets, no, they did not. Or if they were wearing
I was gonna
helmets,
say, and they
they
weren't even
didn't
wearing them. Yeah,
they didn't have corporate logos on it. But there's a certain purity to the sport that took place back then that has just been completely sucked out of it compared to today. And the experience as a fan today, I find somewhat repulsive because of that. And that's why I went on a hockey boycott
yeah.
this year because it just sickens me so much and it just ruins the experience.
It's funny. Once the tap opens, everyone sees how much like they can get away with, basically. Because I remember like when it first started, there was huge backlash, and now there's no backlash. Same
Oh,
thing.
it's
I don't.
become the norm.
Yeah, but it's the same thing in music. I don't know if you remember a band called the Del Fuegos. They were a
Yep.
Boston band, and they
Yep.
did a commercial. They did an ad like for Budweiser. Oh
Hmm.
my God, that basically ruined their career. And then not that long after that, the Stones, one of their one of their tours, not early tours, one of their tours was promoted by Jovan Perfume.
Yeah.
Yeah,
That was the 81 tour.
and they
I
got a
remember
ton of
that.
shit for that. And
Yeah.
then it became the norm.
Yep.
And same thing in hockey and same thing in baseball. It's you go to Fenway Park and the Green Monster is just covered in ads. It's just so
It's
sad,
sad.
you know.
Yeah.
But again, once you can get away with this, okay, maybe we can get away with that. Maybe we can get away with this. Maybe we can get away with it, and it just, spiral.
Well, it's just further evidence that the corporate overlords rule every facet of society, and not just sports, but you drive around, I don't know, any town, any city on the West Coast, Seattle, Portland, San Francisco, LA, San Diego, and I'm sure much of the East Coast too. All of the neighborhoods have had the character sucked out of them there because what happens is houses or little businesses sell to these corporate conglomerates, and they get lots of money for their little plot of land and their little house. The corporation will come in, tear down that house, and they'll put a 8-unit condo with 6 stories with retail on the first floor. And it's just crazy how quickly it happens. And most of Seattle has just been completely annihilated with that. And it's simply, the corporate money comes in and corporate money talks. And how can you refuse $1 million for your tiny little plot? I get it, but it sucks.
And the sad thing, like here, like there's a really funky, cool shopping area called SoCo. And it's now little by little, all the cool local businesses have been replaced by like chains like West Elm or Warby or things like
Yeah.
that. high end, fashion. And it just that.
L'Octane.
But it's interesting, like how much like what you're talking about causes overreaction actually. Like you remember when the CEO of United Healthcare got basically assassinated in New
Yes,
York last
of
year?
course.
And,
Yeah.
and, and there were so many people online calling Luigi, whatever his name was, a
Yeah.
hero,
Right.
and
Right.
like, okay, let me say, I don't feel that way. Okay. Um,
Fuck no.
but
That's
but
disgusting.
but it's weird how it can go to that, you know, it can cause that sort of effect, that.
Um, I mean that sort of thing in a way has been around since uh like the Menendez brothers or even like Richard Ramirez, the Night Stalker.
Yeah,
There's always this contingent of women who will glom on to these people and like write them love letters. Some of them get married while they're in prison. And these are people who have just done horrific things. This Luigi fucknut shot a guy in the back of the head from
yeah.
point blank range, and people look at him as a hero. That is just, I mean, what is wrong with people to think that? I mean, what kind of screw loose do you have to to think that is okay,
you
let
know
alone like it's a heroic
I
act?
I understand you've had bad experiences with the healthcare system. That still does not
Yeah.
justify even thinking that way, never mind acting that way.
And in fact, I know a little bit about this story, and the guy who he shot was like this guy from this guy who worked his way up from like he was born and raised in this little farming town in Ohio or in Iowa, and like totally like busted his ass to get through school, to support himself through school and get this high paying gig with this, insurance company. Like, and the guy who shot him is basically like a trust fund
Yeah.
shithead who was spending all his time partying in Hawaii. And it's just like, God, really, people really aren't seeing this for the way it actually is. And it's sad. And there's so many examples of that going on right now.
Yeah. And in another, thing, another example, not a similar example, but I remember when John Lennon was shot. And then they like, dug into the story later and found that, Chapman had gone up and gotten an album's autographed earlier and so forth, and was
Yeah. Yeah.
theoretically a big fan.
Yeah.
And I was like, what the fuck? Like,
Yeah.
you know, it's it's a strange world we live in.
It
So
is. um, but anyway, um, so as you know, I was waiting for you to ask me why the hell I was in Fort Collins, Colorado.
yes. Yeah, I
Uh,
actually happened to mention that to my mom on an earlier phone call, and she said, "Why was he there?" I said, "I don't know." I said, "I'm going to find out."
so I will spare you from having to ask. So it's dorky, and as you can imagine, I'm sure you could figure you can you probably had some assumptions of why I was there. It was probably music related. Anyway, do you really want to know the story? It's so dorky.
The short version, if there is one.
Okay. I have a very high-end turntable. It's Scottish turntable named Lynn LP12, and there's not a lot of people who work on them in this country, or in the world for that matter. It's a company that's been around for 50 years. Lou Reed was a big fan. In fact, I've seen videos of him going over to Scotland to tour the facility. That's how big of a fan he was of this particular turntable. And anyway, I wanted to get mine upgraded. I've had it for about 15 years, and the thing that's great about these tables is that they are upgradable. So you can, buy a new tone arm for it, or a new platter, or a new power source, or a new circuit board, or whatever the case may be. And there's this guy who lives in Fort Collins, Colorado, who was generally regarded as the guru for these tables and working on them, rebuilding them, upgrading them, etc. So I didn't want to send my table out there
That's what I was
through.
going to ask. Why you didn't just do that?
Yeah, I didn't want to do that because it's just risky. even though if you pack it correctly and everything, it can be pretty risky. And also, I was looking to make a road trip.
Yeah. Okay.
So that was kind of a good excuse. It's 950 miles from where I live. So I packed it up and drove out there, spent the night in Lincoln, Nebraska, on the way there. And then on the way back, that's the halfway point, spent a couple nights in Fort Collins, went to this guy's house with my table. And boy, that was a trip. He has probably he runs his business out of his house. He no longer has a storefront, and the house is probably 2,500 square feet. It is packed to the gills in every single room in the house, and he took me through the whole thing of records, audio gear, or both. And uh, he was clearly a hoarder. I mean, he said he had 100,000 records. He said people have asked him, so he figured out a way to ballpark the number 100,000. But I'm telling you, there would be stacks and stacks of high-end audio gear because he runs a really successful business. Doesn't just work on Lynn tables, sells all kinds of high-end stuff. And he even said, uh, "Oh, I lost touch with reality years ago," referring to how much stuff he had and how much of a hoarder he was. So it was just kind of fascinating for somebody like me who's really into that stuff, to go out there. And then, I had my turntable completely upgraded with all the components. It's basically a new Lin LP12 now at this point, and then drove back with it.
And if he had
That's
said,
it.
I'm looking to take on an apprentice, are you interested?
No, definitely not. I don't want to work anymore. Even working on something I like, I don't want to do. I'm done. I'm done with having any sort of thing I feel like I have to do other than like, whatever, mowing the yard or going to hot yoga or whatever, stuff like that. But no more work for me.
But the funny thing about you're going to hot yoga, because you remind me of my friend Matt from New Orleans.
Uh,
He always had to be at the coffee shop at like 9:30, like every weekday. Because that's the people he would see there. He would always be there at 9:30. And he always had to be there at 9:30. And I remember when I moved, I asked him to actually help me like just get the U-Haul to the place or whatever. And he could only do it for a short amount of time because he had to get to the coffee shop. Okay. You definitely strike me as someone where you have to get to hot yoga. Is that correct?
well, but I'm at the mercy of the studio schedule. That's why it's not like I can go there and do it whenever I want. I,
Right.
I have to go to the scheduled classes, so
But
it
you could,
makes it a little tougher.
but do you skip days?
Occasionally, but I like when I'm out of town or something,
See, but
but I
that's my
certainly
point.
try not to,
Yeah.
you know.
And so but like, would it bother you? Let's say like, like tonight you don't go or whatever. Would
Yeah,
it,
it bothered me.
yeah,
And since Monday, I go 4 to 5 times a week.
yeah.
Monday is one day that I'll never miss. So yeah, unless I had, something really important going on, I will never miss a Monday.
But it's funny because it's someone who says like, I don't want the responsibility of a job anymore, feels like they've got to
Yeah.
be at hot yoga every day.
Well, it's more self-imposed, as opposed to like with a job, you feel like, you're at the beck and call of your employer. So
Right.
you feel like you kind of have to, as opposed to it being a choice. Whereas something like hot yoga, or going to play golf or whatever it is, that's a choice. Um, and I guess in theory, showing up for work is a choice too, but the ramifications are much more serious if you don't show up.
Yes, but with your golf game, it's a more sort of random, sort of thing.
No,
Oh,
actually it's not.
yeah,
There's a scheduled match every Sunday morning
got it.
because I play in a league.
Okay,
And then now that the weather's getting nice, I'll get in about two other rounds a week. So and those are a little more random, and it kind of depends on when some other guys can get away. But the Sunday thing is a definite, and that's a no-no as far as missing that. The league and the chairman in particular frowns upon missing the Sunday match. Which,
yeah.
and by the way, I'm leading the championship so far this year.
Then with the golf
It's
clap.
like it's a season long championship,
Uh,
and I'm gonna win it this year.
Are you like Scotty Scheffler, who's 31 under par in his last tournament?
Fuck. That's just insane,
Like I don't follow
insane
golf, and yet
insanity.
still, I was like, even I'm like 31 under par. Okay,
That's just sick. Those guys, even like the very worst guy who's on the professional tour, is like they have superpowers.
yeah,
They really do that. I mean, that game is so difficult, and for them to have mastered it like they do, it really is kind of like a superpower.
it's crazy. All right, so we got hot yoga, we got golf. Anything else that you have a
Yeah, my ping pong competition.
okay,
I
that's
do that
scheduled.
2 to 3 times a week,
Okay,
and that happens every day except for Tuesdays. So I can choose when to go. But I'll typically go on the days that I know like the best players are there, because that's more fun, obviously. Um, and that basically occurs all day. So you could kind of go. The schedule is a little more flexible. You can go at 9 a.m. if you want, or you can go at 1 p.m. if you want.
so you've had people come and visit you from out of town, and
Hmm.
when they're visiting you, does it like sort of drive you crazy in the back of your mind that you're not at hot yoga, that you're not at golf,
No,
that you're not at
no,
okay,
not at all.
okay,
In fact, some people who come to visit me are golfers, so we're out golfing.
okay.
Um, None of them, would be doing hot yoga or
No,
ping
that
pong.
would surprise me.
Oh, actually, a couple friends who may come in the future would definitely be into the ping pong thing, but no, it doesn't because
Okay,
uh, as you know, when people come to visit, you do your best to cater
yeah,
everything around their visit, especially if you live alone and you don't have a lot of people visiting you in general. I don't, maybe 5 times a year since I've been here. So I'm happy to do whatever they want to do or to just, cater to
yeah.
things that I think they'll like.
That's healthy.
Yeah,
I was
yeah.
concerned if you'd answered the other way.
No,
Okay,
in fact, when I have guests, I don't even think about the other stuff. It doesn't
okay,
bother me in the slightest.
good.
Like if I
Okay,
have to go a week without doing hot yoga, it's not a big deal at all. It's just that if I have nothing else going on, then I'm definitely going to be there.
yeah, yeah.
I,
No,
I
that I
think it's
understand.
the key to staying healthy. I
Yeah,
really
no,
do.
that I
And
understand.
I know you've heard me go on and on about it, but I think it is so beneficial to you physically and mentally, spiritually, and all that, you know, hoity-toity bullshit. I think is really true with that hot yoga.
When I did it in San Francisco, you know where I found it? Slippery.
Sweaty.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm
Um,
trying to grab the back of my foot and like just sliding off. It's like sweat's pouring off my body. But what I love doing was going to the gym to work out right afterwards because my body was so loose,
yes.
you know. So I
Yeah.
always enjoyed that.
That's a good combo for
Yeah.
sure. I don't do weights or anything like that, but I have in the past coupled it with like when I was still living in Seattle. I would couple it with like a little weight training after class, and yeah, that is a good combo.
Yeah, no,
You're doing well if you can do that.
I would head over to Body Kinetics and do like the treadmill or do some weights or do, lat pulls or whatever, So yeah, I always enjoyed that because I was like, man, my body's so loose, you know. So
Hey, so I think we touched on it a little bit, but I wanted to talk about it a little more. There's this new Led Zeppelin movie. It's
yeah,
called Becoming Led Zeppelin. Have we talked about that?
you said you saw it. You said you really liked it. So I've got it in my queue. I can rent it. Ideally, I'd see it in the theater, but I don't know where it's playing around here and all. So I'm probably going to just see it at home and just crank it.
Yeah, it's probably out of the theaters by now, I
Yeah.
would think. It was one of those things that I think had a special limited run in some theaters. Like I saw it when I was in Southern California. Um, One of the things that stuck with me, that I forgot to mention when we first talked about it is, so when punk rock came around, Led Zeppelin was one of the primary dinosaur rock bands that the punks would point at and saying, forget about these guys, these long hair
Yeah.
idiots.
Pompous. Yeah.
Yeah, the dinosaur rock bands, The Who, Led Zeppelin, all of the prog bands like Emerson, Lake and Palmer, yes, and those were the bands that were targeted by the punk bands as being passe and bullshit, essentially. But this movie is called Becoming Led Zeppelin, so basically three-quarters of it is shot during the first year of their existence, and so tons of live footage. But my God, there was no band that played more furiously and in a punk rock style than early Led Zeppelin. Um,
Early
they,
Led Zeppelin. Yes.
yeah, really early.
Yeah.
I'm talking about that first year,
Yeah.
and that's what's featured in this movie, and that's what struck me. It was like, actually, if you got past the long hair and the style of clothes and what have you, and perhaps some of the lyrics, they kind of were like the best punk rock band ever because they could blow away with their energy would blow away any punk band ever. Their energy from that first period, it was kind of like they were playing with the energy of the best punk rock band, but really good musicians. Whereas a lot of the punk bands had this great energy, the Sex Pistols or even the Ramones or whatever, but nobody would mistake them as great musicians. Um, so I kind of it just kind of struck me how they actually kind of were. If you listen to some of that early live stuff, it's kind of like what punk rock aspired to be.
The first Who single, I Can't Explain,
Hmm.
is a perfect punk record.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah.
and but I think if I'm a punk in 75, 76, 77, I'm looking at Song Remains the Same.
Oh, for sure,
Yeah,
for sure.
and the violin bow and the double guitar
Yeah,
and the.
and you can understand the disdain for that sort of thing by the punks. And when I got into punk originally, I wouldn't be caught dead listening to Zeppelin. In fact, a group of my friends and I went to a midnight showing of The Song Remains the Same, just so that we could yell and scream at all the metalheads in the movie. During the whole movie, me and my like three or four friends who were Walla Wallace punks
Yeah.
were verbally fighting with the guys who were really into Led Zeppelin throughout the whole movie. It's just so ridiculous. Um, but yeah,
Got two
it's funny.
sides.
That's a generational thing, and a year when you're a year of your life when you're 15 or 16 can see a lot of changes, and getting into punk rock is one of those that really can just completely change your outlook on almost everything at that
And
age.
I've mentioned before that a little later than that, more when I think I was like 18 or 19. I can't remember exactly what age. That there was a year of my life where I listened to nothing but country records,
Uh,
and then there's a year shortly after that, a year where I only listened to jazz.
yeah.
Went to jazz shows, listened to jazz albums, and it was so weird. Like, and when I got out of both those years, I was like, okay, that was really weird, you know. And I still love old country and I still love jazz, but
Yeah.
I certainly don't pinhole myself. I don't know why. I don't know what made me do that. But I know a lot of old country stuff now from a year of listening to nothing but Hank Snow and George Jones and Tammy Wynette and Hank Williams and so um
I love a lot of that stuff. So I think what you're talking about is sometimes you just you're doing a deep dive into something without even really recognizing it while it's going on. And it
yeah,
sounds like that's what you did. It's like
yeah.
once you came up for air from that, you're like, whoa, I listened to nothing but Freddie Hubbard for the last 12 months.
Yeah. And now part of that also, I was actually a little older for the jazz because I worked with a guy at a job, the guy named Steve Shaker. He'd been in the army and he played in an army band all over like Europe and all. And he was huge into jazz. And he turned me on to all sorts of like Horace Silver and Gene Ammons and all these people I'd never heard of. Like I knew Miles and all, and and Coltrane and stuff like that. But
The biggies.
he turned me on to so much other stuff, and he would make me tapes and everything. And so yeah, a lot of my appreciation of jazz was partly due to him. And then one of my sister's best friends, Eddie, he loved jazz. And so we'd go to a place in Boston called the Regatta Bar where they get like just the top jazz acts and all. And so between listening to the tapes at home, then going to the shows, I was just so locked in, that if
Totally
someone tried to play me
immersed.
something else, I'm sorry.
You're totally immersed.
Yeah.
And
Um,
and I understand that.
and not as long, but there was about 6 months of my life when I was 16 where I was into disco, and there was an underage disco in Boston called Illusions. So no alcohol, but you get in your black and white outfit and all, and go, and you could dance with girls and everything, and they'd be pumping the music really loud. So, and that's why I really know disco songs too, because
Disco,
it was 6 months of that. So.
disco's another one of those genres that quickly became passé, and I never really gave it another thought for probably, I don't know, 20 years. But man, I have a bunch of great disco records from that era. That stuff is really good and really holds up, in my opinion.
And what's interesting is, so there's a big backlash to disco early on because it was music early on that was appreciated by two groups, blacks
Gays
and
and
gays.
blacks.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so there was this whole, backlash to that. And I didn't
Hmm.
even notice at the time because I don't
No, we were too
stuff.
young to really understand that aspect of it.
Yeah, but even as I got older, like because they were doing the whole disco sucks thing, and I was like, what? I didn't get it. Like, it was just strange to me. Now there was an overkill aspect of disco, I've got to say. During the '70s, same with just like there was with Star Wars, where like it was everything was Star Wars, everything was disco, and so and I
That's the
understand backlash to
inevitable.
that,
Yeah, there's an inevitable backlash to almost anything that is somewhat of a flash in the pan or just has this huge rise in popularity very quickly.
Yeah,
It
not even a
seems like,
flash, but yeah,
yeah, I mean, can you think of anything where there hasn't been some sort of backlash to
no,
something?
no,
Think the Bee Gees
yeah,
coupled
and
in with the disco thing, but
when they
there was no band more popular on the
yeah.
planet for a year or so, and boy, that they sank very, very quickly as soon as that backlash started. Another band that I love now, by the way,
in
that
that
I hated back then.
in How Can You Mend a Broken Heart, that documentary about them that you've seen as well, they're interviewing them like a year, like when that backlash is happening, and they're bewildered.
Hmm.
They have no idea why,
Well,
where people were
think
loving them for 2 years, and now people are suddenly hating them.
Well,
You know,
think about the trajectory of their career from like starting in Australia and then having like a couple records out with middling success, and then finally they have some really huge pop hits in the late
yeah,
60s,
they're big.
and yeah,
Yeah,
yeah, really big,
yeah,
and those records are awesome. And then they started sinking.
yep,
The hits stopped coming,
yep. For about
and it seemed like
five,
their
6 years. Yeah,